Greetings, everyone. This is Gardner Campbell at Virginia Commonwealth University, Hub Director for our Faculty Collaboratives Initiative in Virginia, which is called Open Learning 17. And we have determined to bring our Connectivist online course to a grand finale over the next 3 or 4 weeks by hunkering down with a brand new book from our two guests today. The book is called Open and Integrative: Designing Liberal Education for the New Digital Ecosystem. We just couldn't think of a better way to end our discussion about all the shades of open access, open pedagogy, open learning, participatory cultures. Essentially, we've had our guided tour through the digital ecosystem, and now let's see if we can put that all together. We're very fortunate to have the book's authors with us here today. And rather than read their bios to you, which you will have freely available online, I'll ask Bret and Randy simply to introduce themselves, talk about their roles in their respective institutions, and tell us the story of how you came to write this book.
So I've been at Georgetown for 26 years. I started as an assistant professor of English, and I'm a professor of English. I led our Center for Teaching and Learning as its founding director for 13 years. And then I became vice provost for education, where I spend most of my time leading an initiative known as the Designing the Futures Initiative, in which we experiment with new ways to deliver a Georgetown education. In many ways, Bret is sort of, we're counterparts. He's at LaGuardia Community College. He's been there and is the associate dean of the college. He also led their Center for Teaching Excellence for many years and has really been responsible for the full range of curriculum design and assessment programs that have made LaGuardia kind of a showcase community college. I think one of the things that's interesting about Bret and my collaboration is that he and I really have been professional collaborators on nearly every major project we've undertaken since about 1994. Either I've been the director and he's been co-director, or he's been PI and I've been a co-PI or a researcher. And yet, in many ways, we couldn't be at two more different institutions. So I think that one of the things that's been effective about our collaboration is that we've really found the strongest possible points of connection around student learning and our aspirations for what higher education should be, that really reaches across the whole higher ed ecosystem, from community colleges to open access publics to research universities, really what the essence is of the educational mission.
I think everything that Randy said is highly relevant. The other thing that maybe I would add is that we've been, a lot of our interactions or our collaborations go back to starting in the mid-90s, exploring the whole question about what does the digital environment mean. I don't think we exactly used that term of the digital ecosystem at that time, but we've been going back and forth working with a range of colleagues from around the country and really around the world, and exploring the questions of what are the implications of this new learning opportunity, and trying to engage in an inquiry process that opens that up and explores that and gets perspective, as Randy said, from a range of different types of learning institutions.
Well, as you think about how this book came to be, I'd be very interested to know about the context of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. They are publishing the book, and obviously both of you work with the AAC&U very closely. And to talk a little bit about how that synergy happened and what catalyzed this particular moment in your activity in this area.
It was really AAC&U that asked us to write the book. They had been doing a series of statements of publications they were calling Making the Case publications, of which many people may have read, for example, America's Unmet Promise, which is a wonderful book about equity-mindedness on campuses. That was one of the books in that series. And AAC&U had never really had any statement that really was around educational technology or the role of technology in advancing what had been for them a 15, 17-year liberal education and democratization agenda. So this book really emerged out of a project in which they wanted a technology statement. And I was involved with a related project, and so it sort of befell to me to try to move the project forward. And then I pretty early on invited Bret on as my co-author, because I knew that together we could bring a sort of breadth of perspective that I couldn't bring alone. And I think that so that was really how it evolved. And I think AAC&U probably thought that how hard could this be? Just write something about technology best practices.
We showed them how hard it could be.
That's right. Yeah, it took about 18 months from invitation to publication, because in part, anybody, and I'm sure there's many of people listening to the Hangout, and Gardner, you yourself, anybody who's been thinking about these things knows that technology is not the driver of anything in education, though it may be a determinant of how things take place, and it can have tremendous potential, but everybody sees in technology a different level of depth or superficiality or utility versus concept. Find a space in which we were talking to a range of audiences, the people in higher ed who had not thought much about technology but believed in integrative learning. That was one audience. The technology enthusiasts who had not thought much about integrative learning and thought technology was the answer. Those were kind of the two ends of the spectrum we were trying to find a middle path for, and then to write it in such a way that it didn't seem like completely obvious to the people like ourselves who had been thinking about these things for 20 years. So I think one of the great challenges of the book was really and what it's symbolic of is trying to bridge the divide of two discourses that had not really communicated much with each other at all. The kind of deep discourse around integrative learning, and people who sort of really understood the nature of this current moment. There was a small set of people, who Bret and I have been interacting, that have been our community for 20 years. But there was a lot of people outside that intersection in the Venn diagram. And so the book was really kind of symbolically trying to embrace that full spectrum.
Yeah, and I think it is significant that it was AAC&U in that sense, in that they brought that historic deep commitment to integration and to the values of liberal education, by which we're talking about kind of that commitment to the whole person and thinking about a rich combination of what Randy has talked about in other contexts as formation, grounded in powerful acquisition of both content and higher order thinking. And that is probably very different than, say, if we had started, if this had been sponsored by EDUCAUSE. So that we came at it with that context in mind, at the same time with this dialogue that we've engaged with the kind of innovative field in digital learning.
The Venn diagram that you mentioned is a very powerful image, and I agree that there's been distressingly little contact in the middle or overlap in the middle, but two very energetic discussions going on. And one of the things that we've tried to do with our Virginia Faculty Collaboratives initiative is to be very intentional about the technology discussion by focusing on open learning, open practices, open pedagogy, open participatory kinds of learning experiences for students. And so, of course, when we see the word open in your book and coming out of the AAC&U, that's a natural point of connection. So let me ask you this. When you say open, and we'll get to integrative because that's no less important, but when you say open in your book title, what kinds of things do you mean by that?
Well, I think we really meant open in the kind of multi-layered way that you are all using it in the faculty collaborative, or even thinking back to a book like one that Toru Iyoshi from Carnegie edited a number of years ago called Opening Up Education, that the concept of openness really was, in the same ways that things like connected learning or connection is one of those real, sort of core concepts or almost threshold concepts of this, ecosystemic moment, and that it means all of those things. And I think the reason that we were particularly attracted to using the word open in the title was that it seemed so immediately counterintuitive to the commoditized uses of technology, that it was not about the walled garden of the learning management system. It was not about drill and kill. It was not about, customized, personalized systems that were all about assessment and micro concepts and had no context for social learning or social interaction. The whole conception of educational technology as if it closed in, as opposed to made the boundaries between higher education and the rest of the web as porous as possible, as if that needed to be at the center of the paradigm, not at the edges of the paradigm, let alone invisible. So I think we meant open, almost as a sort of, tossing the gauntlet down to the prior 20 years of the development of educational technology. And I think I'll just say one more thing. Had there been more people in that diagram space who understood the technological and the integrative discourse, the last 20 years of the history of the learning management system and then the subsequent history of the rise of MOOCs would have looked a lot different.
Irresistible moment. What has blocked that overlap from occurring?
So my answer to this, which I may regret, is that actually has not been very good at putting teaching and learning at the center of education. I think that too little deep attention to learning has permeated the centers of our higher ed institutions. So by and large, higher education was unprepared for the onslaught of educational technologies that claimed that they could improve learning.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just to, piggyback on that, I mean, I remember saying this, back in, 20 some plus years ago, kind of how higher ed could not actually, there was this, as we started to explore digital technology, there was this says, well, show us that it improves learning. And then we said, well, in fact, how do we show that that teaching improves learning? That higher ed has done such a poor job of focusing on learning that there isn't actually any way of defining or examining what's going on in the learning process. And so that has, I think, moved forward in some very important ways, but it still is this profound gap in terms of the everyday practices in most institutions.
Well, and that's a great segue to the question of integrative. We're talking not just about learning generally in this book, but you're talking about liberal education, a particular kind of learning or a particular conception of learning that's not simply content and delivery, but something more. So say something about that.
Sure.
What is that?
Sure. Well, I think that we might start with how AAC&U defined integration with their the kind of exploration of this. I mean, I took part in the AAC&U's integrative learning project, and then have worked with the value rubrics that attempt to speak to that and to define it in a ways that faculty can focus on it. And in their rubrics, they set out a set of dimensions that would include kind of a range of different kinds of connections. So integrative is obviously about making connections, about pulling things together so that they mean more than the sum of their discrete parts. And so the kinds of connections that they're pointing to there are first connections between different kinds of disciplinary knowledge and ways of thinking, connections across time, understanding learning as a developmental, incremental, recursive process, connections then between learning inside the classroom and learning outside the classroom. And thinking about really, then that starts to point us to connecting the cognitive dimensions of learning to some of the affective dimensions of learning, understanding a sense that learning is taking place with the whole self, and that the deepest kind of learning is trying to encourage not only the acquisition and incorporation of different kinds of content, but the molding of a powerful sense of self, an empowered sense of self, we might say. So if we start with that in terms of understanding integrative, then we also added in this context, trying to think about what did integrative mean in this moment beyond the individual learner, in a moment in which much of what the trend, the discussion in higher education at the time we were working on this was about how do we unbundle, how do we take learning apart and separate it into these discrete bits, building on to some extent an already fragmented learning experience for many students, but further fragmenting it and not thinking about what holds this together. Where do different types of learning occurring in different places come together and build to some larger sense of meaning? And in that context, then we started to think about, well, what could the digital environment do that would help pull those pieces together? How could we use the digital environment for that purpose? And as we did so, thinking about what were the implications, what did that mean for higher ed institutions? And as Randy wrote in a piece several years ago, thinking about if we want students to live or to learn in an integrative fashion, we as higher ed institutions need to think, plan, and act in a more integrative fashion. So there were ripple effects from that core notion that learning needs to be connected for the learner to what are the implications for our institutions and to the larger learning environment in and beyond colleges and universities.
To circle back to something Randy said earlier in the conversation, you, Bret, and Randy work in very different educational contexts to try to effect and model that kind of integrative whole person learning.
Yeah.
Could you speak to the differences in the challenges and opportunities that you see in your different contexts?
I think that in my context, we're obviously dealing with students who are coming with, by and large, a different set of advantages, though their potential is, just very equivalent to the kinds of students that come through Bret's. But where we need to start is probably in a different place and what we can ask of our students, though that's not uniformly true. So it allows us to think about integration in a way that is perhaps sort of less constrained by a certain attention to basic competencies. And because of that, it also, I think, puts us in a position where it's harder. It strikes me that it's somewhat harder to get the faculty in my institution to pay attention to certain fundamental ideas about, say, that people don't think much about learning. They think a lot about their own teaching. They think a lot about the larger educational enterprise at a level of abstraction, but have the luxury in many cases to not look at learning in any kind of detail or with any kind of feedback loop. So the advantage is that, we're probably freer to mess with the pathways and to mess with the rules because we have a population that can take risks perhaps in different kinds of ways. And the disadvantage is that we have faculty who perhaps think that we're already doing everything as well as it needs to be done, that there are few indicators we can point to, like high DFW rates or retention or et cetera, that can motivate everybody to move from a sort of individual sole proprietorship approach to the curriculum to a more collective approach. So I think that makes my environment a little bit less tractable in some ways. But like I say, we also have a bit more freedom, I think, to play with risk where the faculty are willing to take chances because the student body is somewhat different.
So I think it is part of the story with this book and everything we've done is the kind of creative tension between the two environments that we work. So I'm at LaGuardia Community College. Some folks may know a little bit, but I'll just say a word about that. I think people probably know something about Georgetown. They may not about LaGuardia. So LaGuardia is a large urban community college, part of City University of New York, based in Queens. And as part of Queens, we serve about 20,000 credit students and about 50,000 non-credit students. And Queens is really the Lower East Side of the 21st century. So it is New York's immigrant center. And it's sometimes I've thought about it's like working in the Henry Street Settlement House in 1905. It is a fascinating and wonderful place to be. Our students come from 160 different countries. They speak 135 plus different primary languages, overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly poor and working class, first generation attending college, and coming in with probably 90%, between 80 and 90% of any given, entering class requires basic skills education in order to get up to college levels of reading, writing, and mathematics. So it is an exciting group. It's a challenging group because the educational backgrounds that they're coming from come from a wide range, many of them from other educational systems around the world, some of them refugees. The New York City schools have strengths, but there are also many weaknesses. Many of the students come out of very dysfunctional environments and neighborhoods that are marked by poverty and crime and violence. So we have many homeless students. We have a lot of students who are working. We have the largest population of Muslim students outside of Dearborn. Any given class at LaGuardia of 30 students, you'll have students from 20 different countries. You'll have a significant number of women in hijabs. It's a fascinating group to work with. That said, then the advantage perhaps we have is that because those students are so compelling, there is a very strong sense of mission and focus on teaching and learning. That it is, hard to ignore how important these students are and how much they need to be able to move forward and build sustainable, productive lives where in a challenging environment, which increasingly is made clear they're not welcome. Doing that, I think one of the, we do that with fewer resources by far than any other sector in higher education. Community colleges are extraordinarily ill-funded, but we do have the advantage of this sense of commitment to succeed with these students. We're, I think, constantly focused on innovation and how can we change things to try to meet the needs of our students. And one of the things that's become very clear is that one aspect of what they need all sorts of things in terms of some of the basic skills work, some of the thinking about how is this going to help them build to a career, a life in which they have economic stability, etc., but also, critical thinking and resilience and all this. One of the things that unifies that is an understanding increasingly that they need to develop a stronger sense of themselves as learners, as successful learners, that they're coming in very often from the experiences they've had with a sense of having that they're not going to succeed, and that their their identities as learners have been marked by the environments that they've come from. And they're going through all these changes. They're by first generation college students, new to the college environment, new to what college is about. So they need to figure out what college is about. They need to figure out what it means to be a college student, and then what it means to be a successful learner. And so consequently for us, that notion of whole student education is really fundamental and crucial to our student success. And I think in that sense, we're an extreme, or kind of far end of the spectrum example of what's been shown in many other types of contexts, other urban education contexts, but also beyond, which is that a kind of an integrative notion of support, an integrative understanding of education, that it relates to the person, that it helps students understand, why does this matter? Why would I keep going against all the odds? Why would I stay with this when all sorts of other things are pulling me? Makes a huge difference. So that's advising, it's academic support, it's kind of thinking about how we connect with the student, actively engage them, and help them stay with this process. And so we spend a huge amount of attention on that, and have increasingly found all sorts of digital tools to be very helpful in that effort.
You've touched on, I think, a very important question that actually is a little bit of a tension in the book. Certainly in the first 3 chapters we've been looking at in Open Learning 17 regarding challenge and context and strategies. And I'd put it this way: there's the digital ecosystem we build for students as a learning and support environment in the university or the college. There's the digital ecosystem that students live in and bring to the learning environment. Talk about that Venn diagram, because sometimes there's not only no overlap, there's even a kind of resistance, as if the 2 circles just bounce off of each other. So if you could speak to that tension between the ecosystem without and the ecosystem within the university and possible points of connection.
I think that tension is something that I'm looking forward to exploring in our subsequent chats and looking at the annotations in the book, because that's really to me, that's not a question, it's a portal to a much larger discussion. I mean, I think that is a fundamental tension we dealt with throughout the book. I think we tried to acknowledge that the nature of a curriculum, or the nature of a school, just to get really basic about it, is that you are creating certain boundaries and saying we are going to design for this. We are going to design some intentionality that we think is different from informal learning, and we're going to certify the outcomes of that intentionality. For trying to create those constraints and make those decisions and create those boundaries. And I would say that what we tried to strive for was to ask then, how do we think about them kind of both very intrinsically, which is to think about what are students bringing to it, who are they? And I think that all the things that Bret was saying about the whole person and the potentiality of the whole person is connected to what we mean by the intrinsicness of it. And then at the same time to think about sort of the boundary conditions and making the boundary conditions as porous as possible, thinking about the way you're empowering people inside a university by helping them learn how to connect outside the university, how to build networks, how to negotiate networks, how to protect themselves, how to leverage resources that they don't yet control, how to make use of intellectual tools in combination with what might be their own, but not always, their own facility in these digital environments for the kind of what we would call in the Jesuit tradition, the kind of interior freedom that we're trying to help students achieve through this intentionality. So I don't know that I have a soundbite for how to negotiate that tension, except that in my mind, it's both about acknowledging the complexity of what students bring to the classroom and the porosity of the boundaries of the institution. and thinking that the curriculum is not everything. The curriculum is what sits in between the complexity of the individual and the porous boundaries of the institution. And I think that's a fundamentally different way of thinking about what a curriculum is. I think that's one of the that's part of the rebundling versus the unbundling, or the old bundle, is that it's neither whole nor needs to be broken apart, but it has an integrity. And to me, integrity and integration are very closely related. It has an integrity, but its integrity is now as this boundary between the complexity of the individual and the richness and inevitability of the networks that we're trying to teach them to live in.
What he said. I think that's a great note for us to wrap on. That was right at it. So that'll be great for us to pick up on.
Thank you, Bret Eynon, and thank you, Randy Bass, for being part of this conversation today. As Bret has hinted at, teased us with, it is true. We will be doing this again next week on Wednesday, April 12th, from 4 to 5 p.m. Check my date on that, guys, because I'm really good at creative calendaring, as we know. But yeah, next Wednesday, 4 to 5. And the topic we will be talking about next Wednesday will be emphasizing faculty development as well as assessment, which are not really as unrelated as they might think. But I'm going to start pretty strong on the faculty development part, because as both of you have indicated today, and I think Randy has said very poignantly on many occasions, including today, that faculty development is a key part of this, and that development is not necessarily just learning new places to click on. So we will have that to discuss, and some more oceans to boil when we talk again next week. Thank you both for being part of this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody who
LinkedIn.
Bye.